Illinois head coach Brett Bielema said that Nebraska's Memorial Stadium would present a bigger challenge to the Fighting Illini than Penn State's Beaver Stadium. And the rest was history, as Penn State game controlled the Illinois Fighting Illini 21-7. Penn State won the turnover battle. Penn State had 376 total yards to Illinois' 219. Penn State had a 7, almost 8-minute possession advantage on Brett Bielema and the Fighting Illini. And James Franklin and Penn State football give them credit in some previous matchups, including one against Brett Bielema in 2021. This type of game where Illinois was tied with Penn State at the half 7-7 could have gotten away from Penn State. They could have let it slip away, could have choked, and they didn't. They challenged their fan base to show out for what I've affectionately termed a wannabe whiteout, because the official whiteout game didn't take place against Illinois, but everything outside of the name screamed a whiteout. It was loud. The fans were all dressed in white with the white pom-poms. The stadium was explosive. It was an environment unlike anything in college football, but that is what the whiteout is, and that is what Beaver Stadium is, packed with over 100,000 fans at night. It was a good game, good win for Penn State, and if I were to have a takeaway, a broad one for you after this game, it would be either Penn State has the best overall trench play in the Big Ten, or they have one of the Big Ten's best defenses, and potentially the best defense in the conference, and perhaps the entire country. The performance they put out for the entire world to see was amazing, and we'll talk about that and more on this episode of College Football with Sam, and this reaction and analysis to Penn State's win over Illinois. But before we get into that, I want you, yes you, to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, to click that notification bell, to share this video around to other college football fans who love the sport, who are invested in it, who start watching at noon and stop watching after midnight like we do. And also comment your reaction to this game down in the comment section below. What you saw, what your thoughts are. There's a chance, a big one, that you saw something and observed something that I didn't. And also, last but certainly not least, please join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, where we talk about college football 24/7, and there are dedicated conversation threads to all 18 individual Big Ten teams. Again, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below, share this channel and video around so we can get more viewers and subscribers, and also join the Discord server. All of these things help you out, they help our channel out, and all help that our channel receives is reinvested back into the #1 Big Ten football show on YouTube. But Penn State won, and won in a fashion that I think is more dominant than the score indicates. It was not a blowout win by any stretch of the imagination. Illinois was in this game, and I was very impressed with the effort they put up. After all, Penn State's offense was explosive for much of this season. For the first 3 games, they were very explosive. And in this matchup, the Illinois Fighting Illini, well, they held Penn State to under 400 yards, and Penn State's longest play of the day was a 20-yard reception by Harrison Wallace III. That was their longest offensive play. This game, in my mind, sort of reeked of last season's Penn State versus Iowa matchup, except this Illinois team, I think, is much better than last year's Iowa team, at least when they both played Penn State in Happy Valley in a night environment. Last year, Iowa had 6 turnovers, under 100 total yards. Penn State put up 31 points. They had a better kicker than they did this season, and they completely shut out Iowa. But Iowa had no offense to speak of last year, and a defense that was elite, but they didn't play their A game then, and their special teams was awful, and that's very atypical of Iowa. But it reminded me of that game because of the lack of explosiveness that Penn State had. Instead, what Penn State did is they got 4, 5, 6 yard chunks on the ground and about 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 yard chunks through the air. That's really what Penn State did to move the ball here. And you see that in they averaged 5.8 yards per play and 0.313 points per play with only a long of 20. Like, their longest play of the entire day, the entire Saturday night, was 20 yards. And that is in a strong juxtaposition to down south in the SEC, where Georgia and Alabama are like flinging it around the whole field. And a 67-yard catch by Dylan Bell for a touchdown, and then a 75-yard catch by Ryan Williams on the next play. It's in just extreme juxtaposition and comparison to this game, which was very much not parallel with the Alabama-Georgia game. In fact, very perpendicular, very opposite. Slow, methodical, a lot of defense, a reliance on special teams that didn't really pan out for either team. And Illinois only averaged 3.8 yards per play. A lot of that was through the air, and they only scored 0.109 points per play. A tenth of a point per play on only 57 plays. Penn State only had 64. This was a game with not a lot of drives, very slow pace. Illinois, I think, was smart running at the pace that they did, where they didn't want to allow an explosive Penn State offense to have many possessions and opportunities at scoring. And Penn State didn't have many opportunities to score. But at the end of the day, they scored more points than Illinois and came out with a win, and that's what matters. And you see why Penn State won, not just in the raw efficiency of points per play, yards per play, but in the fact they won the turnover battle. They didn't turn over the football once. Penn State, a lot like last season, is very effective at keeping the ball safe. And they had 6 penalties that the Lions did for 63 yards. They were not disciplined one bit in this game, especially early. But Illinois did also have a lot of false starts, and their offensive line was in rough shape. And you got to give credit there to Penn State's defensive line for roughing up that Illinois front, which did admirably against Nebraska. Not a perfect game against Nebraska, but did very well. Here, you see that, not to make this about Nebraska, but Nebraska's clearly a year, if not more, away from competing for the Big Ten, because Penn State's a legitimate Big Ten contender, if not a national championship contender, and if not for, again, some special teams miscues that forced a fourth down that wasn't converted and where 2 field goals were missed, this game would look more dominant than the scoreboard would tell you. But that's why we dive in to more than the scoreboard. Penn State outplayed Illinois, but that doesn't mean that Illinois is a bad football team. They're not. The AP and coaches poll rated them inside of the top 25 today. I don't know if I would have Illinois power rated top 25. I'm a lot more intrigued and interested in power ratings than poll ratings, but Illinois' strength of record is still, I would say, impressive. They beat a 4-1 Nebraska on the road. Kansas fell to 1-4, and they've lost a plethora of close games, so I don't know how impressive that win is, but a win's a win. They were rated high at the time, and they crushed Eastern Illinois and handily beat Central Michigan. And this is a team that is tough. They showcased that Saturday night in Beaver Stadium. They held Penn State, who had a huge explosive play rate percentage through the air, where Drew Aller, as we documented entering this game, was averaging over 10 yards per pass attempt, well over 10 yards per pass attempt. In fact, through his first 3 games, he was averaging over 12 yards per pass attempt. He's still averaging 10.9 after a game against Illinois, where he only averaged 6.4 yards per pass attempt. And he did miss some throws, had some overthrows, Aller did, but overall he had a pretty good day. Altmaier, not so much, but I can't give him too much flack for that against a Penn State defense that is a top 5 unit. It was projected to be entering this season by many, including myself. I had some questions about the unit after that Bowling Green game, but in this game, they looked the part of possibly being the nation's #1 defense. There's no shame that Illinois' offense, who has not been elite or even close all season long, struggled against that defense. And they were able to hold their own, and they competed for a half. And I think the defense in particular is something you have to look at for Illinois and say that's a legit unit. is their defense. Because I don't see too many teams holding this Penn State offense to 21 points, especially at home. Like, I gotta be honest, I don't even see Ohio State doing that. I don't. I don't see Ohio State holding Penn State to 21 points in their own house. A part of that is because Penn State, I think, will play a better game. Obviously, Ohio State will score more than 7 points, I think, in Beaver Stadium when these teams match up. And maybe that statement by me is incorrect, but it was an impressive performance. Illinois was able to sack Drew Aller. They were able to occasionally get behind the lines of scrimmage. And Penn State's rushing attack is brutal. That offensive line, especially on the interior, is good. They have a better interior O-line than they did last year. Tom Fornelli mentioned on the Cover 3 podcast about how this offensive line, despite losing Olu Fashanu, was better at run blocking, and they're probably a better offensive line overall. And I can see that, because when you return Ole Vega, Ione, J.B. Nelson, Sal Wormley, and Nick Dawkins, those are 4 veteran interior offensive line players. And you can see the experience on that offensive line for Penn State. And Illinois, look, they allowed Penn State to run for 5.6 yards per carry, pass for 6.4 yards per attempt, but they did a good job. They did. And I just have to say that Aaron Henry is a name to pay attention to. Ryan Walters is the head coach at Purdue, and he got that gig because of the amazing work that he did at Illinois in 2022, fielding the nation's #1 defense and points allowed per game, and also in average quarterback passer rating against Illinois. And this defense is impressive. They held Aller to a season low passing yards and no passing touchdowns. And they forced Penn State to drive up and down the field and work to earn their points. And Illinois' offense, again, they turned it over twice, and only allowed 21 points. That is a statement from this defense. Credit to them, credit to Aaron Henry. Their leader on the defense in this game, Gabe Jackas, had 1 sack, a tackle for loss, 5 total tackles. Matthew Bailey led the team in total tackles. Miles Scott, Seth Coleman, those are some other players that were involved. When you look at special teams, David Alano was 0 of 1 on field goals. Hugh Robertson once again averaged over 40 yards per punt, pinned 2 of them inside of the 20. Just good performance from a Brett Bielema team. When you think of Brett Bielema, you think of trench play, which in this game was shaky, but you also think of defense and special teams and running the football. Fagan is one tough man, and the special teams, punting the ball, forcing Penn State to go long, was, I would say, good overall. I mean, what was David Alano's field goal attempt? Wasn't it like a long of over 40 or over 50, I do believe? Let me quickly check that. Doesn't say where exactly. Yeah, it was over 40 or over 50. I think it was a 40-something yarder in the 40-49 range. But anyway, I say that to say that when you only allow 21 points, 374 total yards, 6.4 yards per pass, 5.4 yards per run is not indicative of a great defense, but Penn State's rushing offense from the preseason against West Virginia through their first 3 games, it was obvious they have one of the better rushing attacks in all of college football. I mean, they were averaging more rushing yards per game than Ohio State was, with only slightly more carries. And Ohio State has one of the best rushing offenses in the country because of their running back room. Penn State has a great offensive line, a great running back room. I think Aller is a top 10 quarterback right now, and Kotelnicki knows how to scheme guys open. And they didn't allow Aller to do much of anything. Very tight coverage, good discipline. Illinois lasted as long as they were going to last given the constraints of the game and given how these two teams were playing. It was an admirable effort. They do have a legitimate defense. I'm curious to see what they do for the rest of the season. I got to be real with you. They could go 9-3. I mean, they play Oregon, they play Michigan, and they play Rutgers and a few other teams that they could lose to, but also teams that outside of Oregon on the road, I think they could potentially win any of their other remaining games. I don't think they'll win The rest of them outside of Oregon go 10-2 because of how many close games they've been involved in. But 7, 8, 9 wins would be extremely impressive, especially since this team has a lot of remaining eligibility. And also, this is what I was leading into, is the road to Rome is still clear. And what Rome is for Illinois is just being ranked in the top 25 for much of the year, having a 2022 type season. They get a bye this coming week. Then they play Purdue, they then play Michigan, and then they travel to Oregon. They then host Minnesota, get a bye, host Michigan State, play at Rutgers, play at Northwestern. Don't tell me that you think it's impossible for Illinois to go 9-3 with this schedule. I'm not even going to say 10-2. 9-3 is possible. 8-4 is very doable. Not just possible, but doable. 7-5, I'd say they're going to go 7-5. 7-5 means they'd finish 3-4. It may even be a disappointment for Illinois to go 7-5 relative to what they're doing now. I don't always like to adjust my expectations. Sometimes it's fair to do, sometimes not. I think it depends. But Illinois is going to exceed their preseason win total, I think almost no matter what, barring some insane collapse. The only ranked teams they have left to play are then number 12 Michigan and number 8 Oregon. Michigan and Oregon both moved up 2 spots, Oregon to 6 and Michigan to 10 today. But nothing they did in their games really showed that they are invincible. If I'm being honest. Oregon made some stupid mistakes against UCLA. Michigan looks extremely vulnerable for being a top 10 team. Penn State is 7th, for example, and I'd favor Penn State by more than 10 points over Michigan right now. I mean, this is a very weak year in college football. And you see that, I think, when Missouri and Michigan are top 10, and Ole Miss is very close to the top 10 still after what was an embarrassing performance against Kentucky. Let's get to Penn State, though. And neither team in this game, I think, had an embarrassing performance, unlike the Ole Miss Rebels. So shout out to Lane Kiffin for really, with a schedule that is somehow easier than Penn State's, and I don't know if it's easier than, yeah, it's definitely easier than Illinois's. Probably easier than Penn State's too, for just completely wetting the bed, and Georgia will probably kill them. Speaking of a team that may be at Georgia's level, though, Penn State has an elite defense. They got 7 sacks, 13 tackles for loss, 3 passes defended, a pick, and only allowed 7 points. Those are elite numbers for a team that, against a defense in Nebraska that has a really good coordinator and an NFL player in Tommy Hill, another one in Ty Robinson, another one in Nash Hutmacher. They put up 31 points, 24 in regulation. Illinois ran for 4.3 yards per carry and passed for 8 yards per attempt against Nebraska with 4 passing touchdowns. Altmaier had an 84.2 QBR in that game. Penn State held Altmaier to 16 of 25 for 185 yards, 7.4 yards per attempt, a touchdown, a pick, a 37.1 QBR. They sacked Altmaier again 7 times, and yeah, 32 rushing attempts. I know including sacks, but I'm not going to do that calculation on the fly because, well, Fagan only ran for 4.9 yards per carry anyway, and Altmaier was a fair part of their run game. I mean, he had 15 carries, 7 of them were sacks, so 8 times he was scrambling. And Josh McCray had a few carries, same with Aiden Lawry. They didn't go anywhere. And Fagan had a long of 34. So outside of really one run, Illinois didn't do much against Penn State's front. And Illinois only finished with 34 yards on the ground. That's it. For 1.1 yards per carry. It would take, to put this in terms of how bad that performance is, it took Caden Fagan, who is 6'3", 250 pounds, it took him 2 carries for him to match his height in length on the football field. That's how dominant Penn State was up front, guys. Their defense is elite. It makes phenomenal second half adjustments. Penn State's defense, you can put it next to Michigan, and this is proof positive that coaching matters. Coaching matters. Recruiting matters. Development matters. Coaching matters. But often you only hear people talk about recruiting. And I get comments sometimes that say, Sam, you say that recruiting isn't important, and then you talk about recruiting rankings. Which is it? No, guys, that's a misunderstanding. Recruiting is important, but it's overrated. You can have something that's important, but is also overrated. I think a semi-great example, and perhaps I'm getting off on a tangent here, is what you eat. Eating protein is important. Eating healthy is important. But if your goal is losing weight, eating a calorie deficit in Doritos is going to help you lose weight in the same way as eating a calorie deficit of eggs and steak and broccoli. Like, the latter is way healthier and better for you, but you don't need to have the latter to lose weight. And I think that's what recruiting is. It's so important, but it's not the only thing, and it's often made out to be the only thing. Michigan has more NFL players, at least first-rounders, on defense than Penn State does. And yet, the second half adjustments couldn't be any different. Michigan makes second half de-escalations where they get worse after halftime on defense. And really overall. Penn State defensively completely reworks everything after halftime. Against West Virginia, they only allowed 6 points in the second half. Against Bowling Green, they allowed 3. Against Kent State, they didn't allow anything for the whole game, and they allowed 0 against Illinois in the second half. So through 4 games, Penn State has allowed a whopping 9 points in the second half. A whopping 9 points. Just over 2 points per game in the second half allowed. That's absolutely, that's bananas, to be frank. Credit to Tom Allen. He is building a heck of a defense. He's done a good job inheriting what he did from Manny Diaz, who built an elite defense at Penn State last season. And I'm going to go further and show you this. Illinois had to drive 31.3 yards to score a single point against Penn State. That's a lot of yards to just get 1 point against a team who is known to be explosive, against a team who scored 21 points themselves, and a team that has one of the best rushing offenses and trenches in all of college football. That's pretty good. Illinois only scored 0.109 opponent or points per play. And Penn State forced Illinois to punt it 4 times and only score once, and that doesn't factor in Illinois' missed field goal. Wow. Yikes. Yikes for Illinois. Not yikes in the sense that they're a bad team, but in the sense that Penn State's defense was controlling them, particularly in the second half. This is a unit that has to be taken seriously, just like last year's. Last year's Penn State defense was a unit that I didn't think was going to be very physical in the 2023 preseason. I thought it was going to put up a bunch of big numbers and do well in pass defense, but in run defense be very suspect. Michigan was the only team who was able to run on them in that game or during the season, and I think that was great schematics, great coaching, the fact that Blake Corum was one of the nation's best running backs last year, and Donovan Edwards had a kind of breakout game. And Michigan's O-line was also very deep and got better as the year went on. That was the only team who could really challenge them on the ground. I mean, even, and part of this was Ole Miss's offensive line, even with opt-outs and without their DC, they held Quinshon Judkins to less than 4 yards per carry. And most of that interior defense, most of Penn State's defensive front came back from last year. So this is a team that is elite at stopping the run. They're going to get better at defending the pass as the season goes on, as that youth becomes more seasoned in the secondary. Terry Smith, very good secondary coach. I saw him congratulating A.J. Harris on that interception. And you go further and soak this in. Does Penn State finally have elite trench play? I think that may be too early to tell, but can the question at least be asked? Penn State on the season right now is putting up insane numbers running the football. They're one of the better rushing defenses in all of the country. Once you, I think, especially adjust for opponent, playing Illinois, playing West Virginia, playing Bowling Green, who all have, I'd say, good rushing offenses, or at least good trench play on offense. Like they have some parts that are good offensively, which is more than a lot of other teams who've played 4 or 5 games can say about their schedule. And just look at this. They're averaging 5.8 yards per carry. They have 1,000 rushing yards, 1,004 through 4 games, so just over 250 rushing yards per game, 9 rushing touchdowns. Their longest rush is a 41. So it's not like they have 4 75-yard runs. It's not like that. And I think Ohio State's rushing offense is very good, but Ohio State's played an easier strength of schedule, and they have a lot more long runs than Penn State has. It's a lot more boom or bust. This Penn State rushing offense, I mean, do they even allow tackles for loss? Of course they do, but it doesn't feel like they do when watching them. Katron Allen's having a good year. Nicholas Singleton's having a good year. Bo Pribula's involved in the run game. Drew Aller is more involved in the ground game than he was last year. I'm watching him in the pocket or taking the read on the read option and taking the ball and running with it. He looks like a much more natural runner than he did last year. He looks leaner. He looks more nimble. He has better acceleration, better agility, just better handler of the football on the ground than he was last year. And combining that with his improvements in passing the football makes him a lethal quarterback. And all that being said, Penn State's offensive line and defensive line looks as good as advertised from my standpoint in the preseason. And I was higher on Penn State than most. It looks better, the trenches do, than I think a lot of people expected through this year. And the offense overall looks better. They dominated Illinois up front. And they did to Kent State what you should do against Kent State. They came back against Bowling Green and game controlled them in the second half. And they made West Virginia, who is a completely incompetent team overall, but at least competent in the trenches, they burned their own house down with them in it. So I think it's time to have that conversation that Penn State may finally have elite trench play. And you see that in the fact that Penn State had 5 more sacks than Illinois did. They had 10 more TFLs defensively. Offensively, they had 205 more rushing yards. They averaged 4.3 additional yards. That right there is 13 extra feet per carry compared to Illinois. And they had 3 more rushing touchdowns. Just an overall wonderful performance by Penn State in the trenches. Illinois did a good job of limiting Penn State's skill position talent at wide receiver and their passing offense overall, and preventing Singleton from having a big long run where he nearly broke some long runs off that could have been taken to the house, but Illinois always there, just barely getting him, barely grabbing him by the ankles, getting a shoestring tackle. It was a good effort by Illinois, but a better effort by Penn State, who is at this point the better developed team, the more physical team, and the more talented team. And they had home field advantage, and they overcame, and they won. So do they have elite trench play? Let me know. And if they do have elite trench play, does that mean they could be the best team in the Big Ten? We'll figure that out in a few weeks. And last but not least, my MVP for the game has got to be Nicholas Singleton. That one play he made where he rotated his whole body and grabbed a pass from Aller that was overthrown and then trucked an Illinois defender to pick up the first down was awesome. That right there was, I'm more of a man than you type energy. And with 18 touches, 119 total yards, and a touchdown, and he didn't have any big explosive plays, his consistency was welcomed, because Nicholas Singleton has not always been the most consistent player, and he's showing this year that he is more consistent, that he can have that power ability, and pairing that with his finesse, with his mobility, with his speed, makes him a candidate for being one of the better backs in the country. Of course, you have Ashton Jeanty, who's just way better than everyone else, but at number 2, on down, there's a lot of wiggle room. So Nicholas Singleton is my most valuable player. And with that, thank you for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members on my Patreon page. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor OH, Ismar, Tyler 9, Jilton Cush for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members. Make sure to check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server. The links in the description and down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Fighting Illini, and go Nittany Lions.